Okay, everybody. Hope you don't mind listening while you eat. So I'd like to do a talk today on mental models, microinteractions, and more. So this is essentially about interfaces, how people interpret them, how we can improve them by focusing on small interactive details, what I'm calling microinteractions, or what are called microinteractions. A lot of this is derived from a couple of talks that I saw at the Abstractions conference in Pittsburgh a few weeks ago, namely one by UX designer Karen Tang, designing the details. There's also influence from some talks, a talk by Brad Fultz about interfaces. A guy named Greg Nicholas gave a talk on conversational interfaces, which influenced as well. As also the book Microinteractions by Dan Saver. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is an interface. I'm sure you all know what an interface is, but just to explain, it is an abstraction of an engineered system that exposes some underlying functionality in an intuitive way. So it's the layer of a system that hides the complexity of a system and exposes a simplified interface, a simplified face that the world can interact with. It's what allows us to interact with and reason about complex systems that are otherwise unintelligible to anyone but those who built it, sometimes not even to those who built it. So while I'm talking mainly about graphical user interfaces today, one thing to point out is that interfaces in general, as I'm sure you'll realize, are both for humans and for machines. Like I said, I'm talking mainly about, or only about, graphical user interfaces, but the concept applies to any kind of system where you have an underlying complex engineered thing that needs to expose some simplified interface for the world to consume. So this can be obviously programmatic interfaces with a capital I, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but also to machines, event systems, literally connections between physical machines. So the next concept I want to talk about, which is specifically about graphical user interfaces, is the idea of mental models. Again, I'm sure you're possibly familiar with this concept, but essentially a mental model is that which a user needs to build in order to successfully work with an interface. They need to come to understand the rules of the system, not necessarily the engineered rules, but the rules of how to work with it. So they construct a mental model, which is essentially a picture in their head of some kind that tells them how it works. One important point I want to point out is that it is not complex, or it is at least not it's only as complex as it needs to be to allow them to use that system. So it does not, or it should not, and it mostly does not match the engineered system. So the complexity of the underlying engineered system should not be what we're trying to achieve when we're helping someone build their mental model. So essentially they're creating something more like a map, could be more of a picture or a story in their head that tells them basically how to get from point A to point B or whatever it might be. And as they use an interface, their preconceptions, their model is either confirmed or it's contradicted and they have to rewrite it. And as they go through, that model builds up layer by layer. So maybe they decide they now have to go left instead of right, and that further creates the detail for their mental model. So how is a mental model constructed? What are the tools that we use to build them? UI features. These are the things, obviously, that make up a user interface, and they're the things that we build every day. So I'd like to divide them into two categories. Macro features, the big ones, and micro features, the ones that I'm mainly talking about. So a macro feature is essentially corresponds to a user story, whereas the micro feature corresponds to the small implementation details of those stories. Macro features have multiple parts. lots of different parts that might be connected together, whereas a microfeature has very few parts, or maybe one part. Macrofeatures have possibly multiple use cases. A microfeature generally has one use case. It's a single task that a user is trying to achieve at any given time, whereas a macro, larger feature, a user story might be composed of many of them. A macro feature might have a lengthy iterative life cycle, meaning you may spend a lot of time working with something, whereas a microfeature tends to have a very short life cycle. It's a simple interaction that doesn't take very long. So a micro interaction then is the moment of connection with an interface's smallest meaningful features when a user is completing a simple task. And you've noticed I highlighted those three words. Connection, because this is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, where someone is physically or metaphysically putting their hands on your interface and actually manipulating it. And it's the smallest meaningful feature. I say meaningful because obviously you could break something down into even smaller components like a button or a cursor, but the smallest point at which that interaction is meaningful, where someone actually completes some task and gets some work done, is what I'm defining as that micro interaction. And it's when a user is completing a simple task. So this is the smallest task that we can define, other than, like I said, just clicking a button or something like that. So some simple, uninteresting examples of that would be, say, setting a preference, filling out a form field, responding to a notification, confirming a choice, etc. Obviously, there are an infinite number of possibilities of what we would define as a micro-interaction, depending on the particular goals of your application. So these are the details, and some might say they're just mere details, that these are, just details. And certainly, we do want to take a broader look at the larger pictures. We certainly spend a lot of time with user stories, and they're important. But I would suggest that the details are often just as important in how people learn the rules of a system. So these interactive details are really what helps us learn what the rules are of a system. So a rule essentially looks like if some trigger is triggered, then some feedback occurs. And that is what helps us build our mental model. We build our model based on layers of these rules, and as we go along, again, they're either confirmed or contradicted. So here we have a fairly common, uninteresting example of a password field. It's nothing particularly exciting. We've probably seen hundreds of them. But I think it's a pretty demonstrative example of a good, solid micro-interaction. So we have a typical password field with some feedback on the strength of the password. It gets pretty detailed about whether it's working or not. So just interacting with this, just looking at the interaction, what have we learned? You may not think we've learned a lot since it's such a simple thing, but we actually gain a lot of information just from interacting with that. So one thing that comes up immediately is the idea of security. So if you haven't interacted with this system before, one of the first things you might do is enter a password, and immediately tells you that security is a thing. It's important for this system. So for example, if the system were talking to you, it might say password length and complexity matter. That's something you've learned. It's now a part of your mental model of that system. Hacking is a concern. I don't know if you noticed, one of the message was this password is easily hackable. I think that's a big one. People may not think of hacking. They may not. They may be annoyed by all these password meters and telling them it's too short or too weak. But saying your password is vulnerable to hacking, that could change things for people. They understand, oh, that's a thing. I've heard about it in the news. It's important. And overall, it tells them that this system has security covered. So whatever that means, it gives them that good sense of, the system has it under control, gave me the thumbs up, I'm good to go. The other thing that I think this form field shows pretty well is personality. So there were a lot of messages. It was fairly verbose. So that in itself communicates that communication is important to this system. That it takes the time and energy to tell me all these messages. So it's going to be communicating with me a lot. I like that. It tells me what's going on. And whether or not it is, it feels intelligent. So you may know to the extent to which it is or is not intelligent, but to a user, it has the feeling of intelligence, and that itself is reassuring and communicates personality. And lastly, the system itself was friendly. It gave us that nice thumbs up and the smiley face at the end that makes you feel good about your password. You can move on and start working with the application. But obviously, that's not a complete picture. It's not a complete model. Just entering a password or even working with an entire application for a while does not build a complete model. And that's something you have to realize is inevitable, that we cannot possibly fill out a mental model completely. There's always going to be gaps. So who fills in the blanks? The user does. So this is an important point. When there are gaps present in a mental model, and as I said, there will be gaps always, users will tend to fill them with human characteristics and expectations of behavior. Your users, by and large, are not engineers. They don't know how it works, and they don't care how it works. They will fill in the blanks with expectations that they've learned from dealing with people, because that's what we are born to do, is to deal with people. So this could seem scary, could seem like, well, they're not going to understand how it works. They're never going to get it. There's always going to be problems, and it's always going to be difficult for them to use this application because it's so complex. But there are ways that we can take advantage of this tendency rather than fight against it. So one thing I think that example does well is it uses conversational language. As we know, people like to talk to each other, and human-like feedback can help to reinforce not only branding, what is the mood and the voice of your application, but it can reassure people and give that sensation of intelligence. Human conversation is fluid. Generally speaking, we don't talk and call and response. We don't kind of give inputs and expect outputs when we're having a conversation. And as that example showed, it was constantly updating the feedback as you type, having a conversation with you more than just giving you, submit, give you feedback, that kind of thing. It's fluid, it changes, it adapts as you go. And one thing I'll point out, it was funny at the end, and that was, a nice touch. But it wasn't always funny. It was fairly serious about, hacking. And this is I guess this is a tendency I've seen in a lot of applications to kind of overdo it with the humor. And I think it's important, just like when we're having conversation with people, that we're not always funny. Sometimes you need to be serious. Sometimes it's good to reassure people with humor. So the next thing we can do to take advantage of that behavior of humans to expect other human behavior is to read context. So human beings are excellent at inferring context from other people. We do it all the time, usually without even thinking about it. When we're having a conversation, there's so much information that kind of comes in from the context that informs the situation. And this is something we can do in our applications to make them smarter, to make them look at, hey, what time of day is it? Is that relevant to this input? What did they previously do that might tell us something about how they might want to do something now? This gives the greater impression of intelligence and friendliness. Perhaps it is more intelligent. Maybe we need to make those micro features more intelligent in order to achieve that. But at least it gives that impression and gives people a good experience. And lastly, to adapt. seriously, don't always be funny. If it's a light introduction, great, show some humor, be quirky. But if you're deep into an application and you need to do something really quick, be quick, let them do it, don't get in their way, don't overload them with some stupid joke that doesn't mean anything. Or if they're recovering from an error, by all means be serious, tell them the information that they need to know, what went wrong, how to fix it, that kind of thing. Just like we talk to people, we adapt ourselves to the environment, we adapt ourselves to the context about what's going on, and our applications should do that. And the last thing, which sort of ties those two together, is making assumptions. Generally, we say making assumptions is bad, and I think what we mean by that is making broad, overgeneralized, inappropriate assumptions is bad, but we make assumptions all the time. We wouldn't be able to communicate successfully without making assumptions. We know things about people, we don't know things about people, and in order to communicate, we need to assume certain things. And our applications should do that as well. We can base these assumptions based on profile, what do we know about them, or what's their age, what's their gender, what's their credit card number. We could base it on the environment, again, is it night or day, what did they recently do, and on their previous behavior, which is a big one. What shows us, it shows us what they might or might not be comfortable with, and it allows us to kind of make predictions based on what they will want to do in the future. And the one-liner from that is don't start from zero. Whenever you can, don't just give someone an empty screen and hope for them to figure it out. There are things you can assume that they might want to be doing. If someone comes back to a form that they had started previously, by all means, put the cursor in the next field, let them continue. If they're creating a new thing, fill in their name, fill in whatever information you might know. Even if you're wrong, which chances are you probably won't be wrong, if we take the time to really think about it, it shows your thinking, and that again contributes to the sensation of intelligence and friendliness. So that's basically it. In summary, mental models are not the same as engineered models. We have the interface being an abstraction layer that hides those engineered models. Our macro features correspond to our user stories, and our micro features are the details. The micro interactions being the smallest meaningful tasks of an interface detail, and those details help us to build mental models. Again, users fill in blanks, and we can take advantage of that by using conversational language, reading from context, and making assumptions. Thank you. Any questions?
I'll bring the mic around to you.
Yeah.
Do you feel like interfaces are always responsible for making a task easy?
To an extent. Some tasks are just not easy, so you're kind of leading through it, so yeah, I guess so.
I guess a lot of times what I wonder is if you have an application or some piece of software that really does something useful, that you, in order for it to be useful, there's a certain learning curve, right?
Well, easy is relative, obviously. It depends on what the audience is, what they're used to doing. If we're making an application for, bankers who are used to dealing with lots of numbers, there's an extent to which we can't dumb it down and shouldn't. You expect a certain amount of knowledge, and that's the context I'm talking about. You know what your users know, and show them that you're intelligent enough to give them that. So sometimes you can't just make it easier, and you shouldn't.
I agree with that.
Are there things we should be looking out for that if we're doing it, that we're wrong and that we should be paying attention to microinteractions as a way of communicating?
I think a lot of it can happen in planning user stories to think a little bit more about some of the implementation. A lot of times we have a large task that a user story talks about, and then it's just sort of implemented. However, I think some time can be put into thinking about, okay, what's the context? What do we know about a person at this stage in the life cycle of whatever part of the application they're using, and trying to inject some of it that way. There's no like easy way to do it, because a lot of these things are just clever details that you would only get based on a particular scenario. And it's just about really thinking about it and saying, okay, what's the context here?
Great, thanks.
So as engineers, we spend a lot of time architecting the models that are happening behind the scenes in the implementation. Should we as a team be spending time documenting and designing what the mental models should be for our users?
It's a good question. I've never thought about how we would actually document that, but it's probably a good thing to do. So what is the engineered model? What is the data schema, if you will? And what do we expect people will how do we expect people will think about that? So yeah, I think so. There's something I read about object-oriented design, which kind of aims at that, which is sort of taking the object-oriented model of engineering and applying it to the design process, where we're thinking, oh, what are the objects that people have in their head? What are the ways they manipulate those objects? So doing those kind of things will help us understand what their models might be. Cool.
Great. Thanks again, Andrew.
Thank you.